Today on America's Test Kitchen, Bridget cooks Vietnamese beef pho. Gadget guru Lisa reviews the Adjuster Cup. And Becky prepares Singapore noodles. Right here on America's Test Kitchen.
I'm here in the kitchen today with Chef Tien Ho, who's going to show us today how to make an authentic version of the famous Vietnamese dish known as
pho.
There you go.
A beef version of pho, and then more specifically the Southern style.
Southern style.
We're doing Southern style based on my mom's recipes, of course.
Well, there you go.
A lot of people disagree about the name pho. A lot of people argue that it came from pot au feu, which is a classic French dish. Others argue that it came from the French soldiers when they saw pots of this boiling broth under the fire and say pho, which in French means fire. But what is clear is it came about in the 1920s in the northern part of Vietnam. So Doc, we have beef bones,
Right.
we have a rump, oxtail, and a shank.
Great.
Doc,
All
give me a hand.
I will.
Great, thank you. So we're just gonna put the meat in the pot. We're just gonna cover it with water. We're gonna add the onions and ginger, and we're gonna char it on this cast iron. So the French term for this is brûlé. And this is gonna give that real rich caramel flavor to the broth. So it's been about 2.5 minutes. I'm gonna turn it over and take a look. There we go.
There you go.
So now we're gonna just add this to the broth. All right, so now we're gonna add the spices. The North tends to use less spice and a cleaner broth, whereas the Southern style, you'll see a lot of cinnamon, star anise, cloves, and fennel. We're also gonna season it with some palm sugar, some salt, and some fish sauce. That's it. Now we're gonna let it cook for about 1.5 hours, 2 hours, depending on the size of the meat. As soon as it comes to a boil though, we're gonna skim it, get some of the impurities off.
So it's been 2 hours. The meat is out, and this smells amazing.
Let's go ahead and strain the stock. Okay, Doc, we're ready to assemble our pho. So these are rice noodles. So now we'll add our,
Several kinds of beef.
yes,
Some of the raw.
raw. Now you want to put the raw right on the top. And the reason why is we're gonna pour our hot broth right over it
To sort of cook it.
to sort of cook it, exactly.
That smells good.
Now we garnish it however you like it.
Lime juice and Thai basil.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just a little bit on top.
Just mix everything all up
Yeah,
together.
mix it all together. And then we eat.
All right. Wow, that's awesome. I mean, you get all that deep flavor from the caramelization and that long simmering of the beef, and then you get the brightness of the herbs and the lime juice. All the noodles and that broth is, you can just eat the broth by itself too.
You sure can.
Thank you, Tien. This has really been fun, and this is spectacular.
Thank you.
And now we're going to go back to the test kitchen and figure out how you can make pho in your home.
Now, this is a true story about Bridget. I love true stories.
I don't like true stories about Bridget.
2 nights ago, you were driving home and your bumper fell off.
That's
on the road.
right.
So you stopped at a Target to buy, I'm not kidding, a sledgehammer and duct tape to reattach the bumper. And you're sitting there with duct tape, everything, whacking
Yes.
the bumper. Someone came and said, "Hey, are you Bridget Lancaster?"
That's right.
Which is the worst moment. So my feeling is if you can fix a bumper with duct tape,
Right.
you can probably make a Vietnamese soup.
Oh, this is a lot
is a
easier
lot
than
easier.
fixing a bumper on a car, I can tell you that. And it's a lot tastier to eat too. But this is one of my favorite soups. It's all about that rich beef broth. And the broth, the traditional broth, is made by simmering bones in water for a really long time, and it extracts the flavor. And then you ladle it over noodles and beef. It's just one of the best things ever. So I'm going to show you how easy it is to make, but we don't have to simmer bones for hours.
And you don't have enough time because you're busy reattaching your bumper with duct tape.
This is true.
So.
This is true. I've got to make this in a hurry. So what we needed to do is find a way that we could use commercial, already made beef broth, but amplify that beefy flavor. So what we're going to use is ground beef. This is a pound of 85% ground beef. We're going to cook this with the beef broth. And since the beef is finely ground, it's going to release its flavor very quickly. But first, before we add the beef broth, we want to blanch the beef, and I'll explain why here in just a moment. But for now, I want to pinch off about 1-inch pieces of the meat, and that's so it's going to be easier to fish this out a little later. There we go. And now, I'm going to add just enough water to cover the beef. All right, that looks good. And I'm going to crank the heat to high. We're going to bring this up to a simmer, and then we'll let it simmer for 2 minutes. All right, you can see this technique worked, all that collagen. I'm not going to call it scum out loud. Oh, I just did. But now we get to drain it off. And you can leave the pot in the sink there for a moment. Now I need you to rinse off the beef because there still is a lot of surface fat. And you can see all that stuff that's getting rinsed away. And I need you to rinse out the pot. Yeah. So pot goes right back here. I'm going to go ahead and put the beef right back in there. That's just the water on the bottom of the pot that's making that little sizzle. All right, so let's now work with another ingredient. We have onions. There are 6 onion quarters, so we quartered them right through the root and stem. I'm going to put these 6 quarters right into the pot with the beef. All right, now I did say before that we're going to use regular beef broth that we bought at the supermarket. This is low sodium beef broth, 12 cups of it. And second one, couldn't fit it all into one container, so more beef broth. Again, 12 cups total. Now I've got 2 cups of water just to cut this so it's not too tinny. This sauce should have a sweet and salty flavor, and we're going to get a lot of that salty flavor from fish sauce. This is a 1/4 cup. And besides the onion, the other aromatic that we're going to use is ginger. This was 1 4-piece inch of ginger that we sliced into these thin rounds.
You don't have to peel it, which is nice.
We're going to retrieve all of these ingredients out of the broth later on. Got a stick of cinnamon. In it goes. And 6 pods of star anise. Aren't they pretty? Mm-hmm. 6 cloves. A little bit of these go a long way. And now here's the sweet. 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar. And 2 teaspoons of salt. And a teaspoon of black peppercorns. All right, so we want to bring this up to the boil over high. And then once it's at a boil, I'm going to reduce the heat to medium-low, and we're going to cover it with a lid, just partially cover it, and let this simmer for about 45 minutes until all that beef flavor is extracted. Last little bit of prep. Now, one of the best parts of this I mentioned was the beef that's shingled in the bottom of the bowl, and then we ladled that hot broth on top. So we wanted to start with a cut of beef that was very, very tender. We're going with a boneless strip steak. Great flavor. And this is a pound. So what we're going to do is use a technique that we often do when we want to slice any kind of protein very thin, and we're going to freeze it or par freeze it. But before I do that, I'm going to cut this in half. I'm also going to trim away any of these really kind of hard knobs of fat because we don't want to eat them later on. So these are trimmed, put it back on the plate, and these are going to go into the freezer for about 35 minutes. All right, Chris, the meat is out of the freezer. It's quite firm and ready to slice. I'm going to stand it right up here, and we're going to use a very, very sharp knife to cut paper-thin slices, about 1/8 of an inch thick, against the grain. And that is going to help shorten any long strips of fiber and make this meat even more tender. So just take your time. If you have to stop and resharpen it halfway through, that's fine too. These are all nice, thin. Now these have to go back into the fridge. We want to keep them nice and cold. So if you wouldn't mind putting them in the little lower fridge over there. All right, so there's the broth. Gorgeous aroma. So now we need to strain it. We want to get all the onion and of course the beef strained out. So I'm going to strain it through a mesh colander right into a big old bowl. Oh my goodness. This is my kind of aromatherapy. Okay, Chris, if you could get rid of this for me, we are done.
Sanitation engineer.
Thank you. All right, so now we want to strain this again because remember, we're looking for a really crystal clear broth. So I've got a fine mesh strainer this time and 3 layers of cheesecloth. I'll line the mesh strainer. And we're looking for 11 cups total of broth. We may have over-reduced it, but that's okay if we do. We just simply want to add water back to it. We want to make sure that there's enough broth to serve 4 people. And also that it isn't over-reduced and way too seasoned. Into the pot. All right, so we're going to leave this to simmer over low heat. Lid on, keep that warm. Finally, the other star of the show, noodles. So this is about 14 ounces of rice noodles. And we like the size that's about 1/8 of an inch wide. These are called small. Now, I have a couple of different versions of rice noodles. These are too thick. They actually won't soak very well for our noodle soup. And these are just way too thin.
Okay.
So we're not going to just put these right into boiling water because they don't cook very evenly. We actually found it was better to soak them first in hot water before we boil them. So let's head over to the other sink. I'm going to cover these with very hot tap water. All right, there we go. Now we're going to let these sit here for about 15 minutes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes until they become pliable.
First letter today is from Sue in Fairfield, Connecticut, and she writes, "My cast iron smells. Is there any way to easily deodorize it?" Well, for years we suggested heating a cast iron pan with oil and kosher salt on top of the stove and then cleaning it out, but that does make a mess. There's actually an easier way. Simply put it into a 400-degree oven for about 10 minutes, and here's why that works. Sometimes you get oxidized fatty acids from cooking foods in cast iron, and those dissipate or burned off at about 350 degrees. So 10 minutes in a 400-degree oven and no mess actually solves the problem. Next up is Erin from Portland, Tennessee, and she writes, "I'm a big fan of whipped cream, but I've recently been diagnosed as lactose intolerant." Well, there's actually a great solution that's even better than whipped cream, and that is coconut milk. Refrigerate a can for a few hours, open it. There's about 3/4 cup of the fatty part of the coconut milk on top. Take that out, put that into a mixer and beat it with a little sugar, vanilla, and a dash of salt, and you'll have whipped cream that's actually from coconut milk, not cream. Next letter is from John from Hillsborough, North Dakota. He writes, "Why are my ice cubes always cloudy?" The reason they're cloudy is they're dissolved gases and minerals that get pushed into the center of the cube as the water freezes. The way around that problem is to use distilled water, boil it for a few minutes to get rid of the dissolved gases, and then freeze it, but put the hot water in the tray and put that in the freezer. You'll end up with perfectly clear ice cubes and they'll last twice as long as regular ice cubes. Finally, we have a letter from Stavi from Portland, Oregon, who writes, "What's the best way to get my wife excited about cooking?" Well, in my experience, the best way to get your wife excited about cooking is simply to do the dishes. If you'd like to contact us, write us at atk@americastestkitchen.com.
All right, so we can see that the noodles, which have soaked, are nice and pliable, but they're not overcooked. So I need to drain these. Now these are going to go into 4 quarts of boiling water, just about 30 seconds to a minute. You don't want to overcook them. So let's start assembling the soup. We'll start ladling the bottom with lots of noodles. All right, and some of that beautiful beef, we're going to leave it in a nice shingle here. And the sliced onion, and of course, some scallion and cilantro. And now we can go ahead and ladle this hot broth. And that has to be really simmering in order to cook the beef through. Got some bean sprouts here. I think they're essential for that crunch. And this is Thai basil. It's got a little bit more of a peppery kick than regular Italian basil, but Italian basil is fantastic as well. Of course, lime wedges, that gives it that sour component. Sriracha, little kick.
I think it looks great. I think it smells great. I very much appreciated the fact that you cooked it, because this is one of those dishes where it's easy to do, but there are a lot of components, right? Yeah.
It's true, but from start to finish, this was about an hour of cooking. You tell me if it was worth it, but I think that's pretty fast.
This has depth. It has a lot of the flavors like the cinnamon and the fish sauce. It's complex, just like you.
And balanced,
And
just
balanced.
like me. And the meat is so tender.